First up was the meeting properly posted?
Yes, it was.
Excellent, thank you, Darren. Next up on our general business is opportunity for public comment, and we have two speakers this evening. And the first speaker is Karen Fraley. So we have, just some simple ground rules, no profanity or cheering or inappropriate comments. So you're up.
Is the microphone working this time?
There you go.
Seems like, okay, just checking. All right, so good evening, everyone. I'm back. My name is Karen Fraley. I live at 414 Everett Drive in Waukesha. And I'm sure you can probably guess that once again, I'm here to ask you to upgrade the ventilation in our schools and most critically, to provide HEPA air purifiers for all classrooms and shared spaces, including cafeterias and bathrooms before the start of the school year. I'm also here to ask that you require masks, at least for the first 2 quarters of the year, at which point we can take stock and evaluate the latest pandemic developments. And I know that some of you don't want to hear this. I was also really hoping that we were already through the worst of the pandemic, but please understand that Delta has changed the game and made it critical that we act. COVID is airborne. So imagine, if you will, that, for example, Mr. McCaffrey over there lit up a cigarette and started smoking. He's well over 6 feet away from me. But how long would it be before I could smell the cigarette smoke? A minute, maybe less? And that is precisely how COVID travels through the air. It travels through the air like smoke. So similarly, if Mr. McCaffrey were infected with Delta and he was just sitting there breathing, it would take less than a minute for that to reach me, for the infectious aerosols to reach me. And if he were singing or speaking loudly, it would be even faster, and the quantity of infectious aerosols would be even greater. But now imagine that there were a HEPA air purifier in the middle of the room between us. And just to clarify, this means a simple HEPA air purifier, just mechanical filtration. It doesn't need ionization or UV or anything fancy. That would significantly reduce the amount of cigarette smoke or infectious aerosols that would get across the room. When HEPA air purifiers are combined with universal masking, the amount of infectious aerosols in a room can be reduced by over 90%. And these are the kinds of precautions we must take in order to open schools safely this fall. Because children under 12 can't be vaccinated, and on August 5th, the U.S. set a single-day record for children admitted to the hospital with COVID-19. Pediatric ICUs are filling up with patients across the South, and it's only going to get worse as more schools start up. Test positivity for children ages 5 to 11 is 10.9% nationally and rising. And at one clinic in the area here, positivity among children over the weekend was at 33%. We're also seeing kids with COVID and RSV co-infections. Masks and other public health measures reduced flu and RSV to near zero last year. But what's going to happen this year if we don't take those same precautions? And please understand, children do catch COVID. They do transmit COVID, and they do die of COVID. But death is not the only negative outcome of COVID. There's a doctor who's been collecting stories of children who survived COVID, and I've included a few of the stories here, and I printed them out. So if you could enter these into the official record and hand those around. So these are stories like 5-year-old Peyton Copeland from Texas. She, along with both of her parents and all 4 of her siblings, caught COVID. She recovered, but a month later, she came down with the multi-system inflammatory condition, MIS-C. And by that night, she was in the ICU, and by the next day, she was on a ventilator. 12-year-old Juliet Daly from Louisiana didn't have typical COVID symptoms. Instead, she had severe abdominal pain that progressed to heart failure and cardiac arrest. She survived after a lengthy ICU stay, but she has many months of recovery ahead. Or take the story of 3-year-old Colt Paris from Missouri. He suffered a stroke caused by COVID. He survived after having brain surgery to remove the clot, but he is now paralyzed on his right side. There are many, many more stories like this. Some of them you can read on the handout I gave you. Children with long COVID who used to be athletes and now can barely walk across the room. Children who used to be star students who now struggle to do basic arithmetic. COVID does affect children, and those effects can be permanently disabling. So please, I am begging you, don't let our schools open with no masks and no air purifiers. Don't let children go to school unprotected. Don't Don't let an entire generation end up with potentially life-altering consequences. Mandate masks and provide HEPA air purifiers for all of our classrooms, bathrooms, cafeterias, and other shared spaces before the start of the school year. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Next up is Rebecca Damore. Thank you.
My name is Rebecca. I'm a resident of Waukesha. My son will be a first grader in the Waukesha School District. I also have a 3-year-old at home. There is currently no COVID vaccine available for my 2 children. I am here again today respectfully to implore the school board to reinstate COVID mitigation efforts in the schools, especially in the elementary schools where no students are currently eligible for the COVID vaccine. According to the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, the number of COVID cases in Waukesha County has continued to steadily increase. Since my statement last week, we have moved from 140.2 cases per 100,000 people to 281 cases per 100,000. Statewide, we are over 1,000 cases per day, which is higher than when we had a mask mandate in place last year. In the midst of the contagious Delta variant, I am deeply concerned about sending our children to schools where mitigation efforts are optional. Because my child is in the dual language program, he has no virtual option at this point. I am asking this board to instate the recommendations of the CDC, DHS, Waukesha Department of Public Health, and the American Academy of Pediatrics in our Waukesha schools. Today, I would also like to talk about mental health. Some in favor of a masks optional approach in our schools will cite the mental health of our children as the reason masks should not be required. I assert that following the science-based safety guidance of the CDC, AAP, and DHS would be the best possible way to promote the mental health of our students, staff, and community. I think we can all agree on this point. Our kids need to be in school. Keeping our schools open is vital to the socialization and mental well-being of our children, staff, and community at large. Yet reducing COVID mitigation efforts regarding masks and quarantines puts us all at greater risk of widespread outbreaks. If teachers and staff get sick, who will teach our students? If students get sick, how can they attend in-person learning? Again, putting the mitigation efforts in place ensures that we are doing all we can to keep students learning in a safe, in-person environment. In its July 19th statement, the American Academy of Pediatrics addressed children's mental health extensively. It is unmistakable from their statement that they prioritize the mental health of students and even encourage schools to, quote, adopt an all-encompassing approach for mental health support, end quote. And they also state that it is their recommendation that everyone older than age 2 wear masks, regardless of vaccination status. In considering what is best for children's physical and mental well-being, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommend universal masks in our schools. Finally, integrating all COVID mitigation efforts recommended to keep our unvaccinated children safe would greatly reduce anxiety and feelings of helplessness for many families in our district. I would like to end this statement as I did last week. Please don't wait for an outbreak in one of our schools before putting the AAP, DHS, and CDC's guidance into place. Thank you. Thank you for your time and really for considering this seriously.
Rebecca. Alrighty, that's everybody who wanted to speak, and I don't see anybody else in the gallery, so moving on to our action items. First action item up is approval of minutes from the July 5th, 2021 meeting. And those are some short minutes. Yes.
I'll move approval of the minutes from the July 5th meeting.
The other person that was at that meeting was second? Thank you. Was there any discussion on those minutes? None. Alrighty, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That's 4-0. The next action item is approval of the minutes from the July 7th, 2021 meeting. Looking for a motion for approval?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Montiel. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Como, any discussion on those minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? None. That's 4-0. Next up, under action items, is approval of vouchers. Did we have any questions? No. Okay. No questions. Okay, so I'll be looking for a motion to approve vouchers.
So moved.
Keith, is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Montiel, thank you. Any comment, any questions regarding the vouchers?
Early part of the year, so
It is, they're a little thinner.
a little slower now.
They are a little bit slower. Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. 4-0. Next action item is approval of easement request.
Yeah, there's no action to be taken on that.
Okay.
And I thought it was an easement. What it actually is a agreement of maintenance on our storm retention plan at Butler.
Okay.
So he wants us to approve a document that we will maintain part of that system, which we would anyways, but it'll come back to you next month. We don't have the documents yet, but
Did we have to put a pond in up there, or we did?
No.
According to the size of the impermeable surfaces?
I think it was the size of the asphalt and the
Asphalt,
expansion of
okay.
the asphalt.
Okay, excellent. All righty. Moving on for our last action item, which would be the approval of the 21-22 preliminary budget tax levy.
Okay. Per state statutes, the board has to approve a preliminary budget. We will then publish it and then have a public hearing in September. So I'd like to start with, there's a document called Tax Scenarios, and thought that'd be a good place to start. So this is a pretty simplified one in that it shows last year's, it shows what we're proposing with the budget that's been presented, and that's basically the July 1st aid estimate, which holds our per pupil and, per pupil aid and the per member in the revenue limit flat. I put in there the October 2021 column because it kind of gives a good picture on what could all change between now and October. There's just so much that goes into developing the levy, and so much of it is unknown at this time. So this is our best proposal that, with the information that we have. It has our revenue limit at 128,196,626. That's a drop of a little over $2 million from last year, and part of that is from everything being held flat and all of our numbers going down, even though we have projected to have an increase of 71 pupils by an average this year. So hopefully that will hold true. We won't know that until September, the third Friday count in September. So that's one of the big pieces of this. You can see how many pieces are dependent on that. And even with that, if that changes a lot, it really impacts our hold harmless and our declining enrollment exemption. So the overall levy probably isn't, or excuse me, the overall revenue limit probably isn't going to change that much with any fluctuation away from that number, because it's really just going to impact those hold harmless and declining enrollment exemptions. So then if you look down, our state aid, the July 1st estimate is $51,777,526. That's a drop of 1.21% from the prior year. The computer aid and personal property aid, those are expected to hold and stay where they're at. Don't expect to change, but there'll be a final release on those in October. So given that, we can look at what the levies are that we're proposing. We don't have Fund 38 anymore because that debt was paid off. Fund 41, we're looking at holding to last year's amount of $3,258,407. And then Fund 10 would be $72,959,536. Our prior year chargeback we know is $22,600. That would leave a Fund 39 levy of $13,435,075. That is including a defeasance for next year in that amount. So as we get the final numbers and see where we land, we'll, have the board decide if that's the course that you'd want to pursue. Fund 80 is about 310,000, just a smaller levy out of all of them. But basically, it brings our levy to 89,986,532, and that's a change in the levy of 1.89%. We're assuming a 2% increase in property value, although last year was 4.56%. So if that holds true and it continues to increase, that could drop the levy amount. Last year, we were at 8.3. This year, it's falling in at 8.2. So we'll know the final numbers in October. Any questions on this page before we move on to budget book?
Just a couple of things. The first one ties into an agenda item we have related to long-range budget planning, but Sherry mentioned the decline in the revenue limit of $2 million, and part of that's tied to declining enrollment. Part of it's from the drop of Fund 38 because we don't have those debt payments anymore. But the net drop is about $1.2 million if you don't factor in Fund 38. So, stagnant revenue is kind of where we've been, kind of bouncing around $128 to $130 million. The aid is their estimate, but we underspent. They use our budgeted number. We underspent our budget, so our aid should come back a little bit. I also don't know if this aid number reflects what the final state biennial budget ended up being. My guess is it probably didn't because of the timing of those two are very close to each other. Maybe they adjusted for it, but and then lastly, the biggest thing is we kind of just targeted a similar tax rate to last year. We have a defeasance or a total Fund 39 levy in there of $13.4 million. We'll fine tune that conversation heading into October once we know real numbers and how much we want to defease and what we think we can do. So just a few other topics to think about as we move forward through the rest of this report.
Okay, then why don't we look next at the preliminary budget book, and I guess I won't go all the way through it, but I would like to talk on the highlights page. If I can, sorry, still working through an iPad. So some of if you look on page 1 of the preliminary book, there's some of the things we've talked about a little bit, but we talked about the resident pupil enrollment. We had dropped an average of, we dropped 469 resident ADM last year. We're anticipating an increase of 71 this year. So we already talked about that a little bit. The voucher program participation, we're holding it constant right now at this point, but that will change again in September. We'll know more information on that. And that, though, is what I've talked about before. You get an exemption for the amount that it's going to cost you. So even if that does go up, our expenses go up, but the exemption goes up. So it's a 1-to-1. Open enrollment. Open enrollment is an interesting animal this year. We had projected it at one number, which was, we had spiked quite a bit in open enrollment last year because of the pandemic, and eAchieve brought in a lot of numbers. So when we were doing the budget early on this year, we were looking at bringing it down halfway to where it was before the pandemic and the pandemic, because we do expect there's still going to be we expected that there'd be some residual carryover. What I saw last week is that our applications are way down for open enrollment this year, substantially down. So I don't know how much you know about open enrollment, but there's the open enrollment period from February to April, and that's where parents lock in on a regular application. Those numbers are known. Right now, eAchieve is down, just eAchieve alone is down, I believe 280 applications is what they had indicated. But they do get a lot of their applications sometimes in what's called the alternative application. So after the open enrollment period ends, the alternative application period opens. It's open for as long as we want it to be open. We can accept applications through that. Just the danger of that for a parent is that the resident district can say no. There's more leeway to say no on that side. There needs to be a reason, usually things like bullying or things like that, or where people would jump on, partially into the year. But even the alternative applications seem to be coming in slower. Now, August is usually the biggest month, and then July, and then January, because at the semester people change. But our numbers to date are pretty low on the alternative applications. Now, the one thing that isn't factored into there is that once you apply, you don't have to reapply. So we might have higher numbers this year just in the students repeating it, and that's why the applications are down. But boy, generally your applications stay fairly constant. So that's a big unknown at this point and could impact. What happens is our open enrollment revenue gets looked at compared to the open enrollment revenue out, and then we have the net difference, which has always been a nice positive for us. And depending how this open enrollment ends up fleshing out, we really won't know until September when we're doing our third Friday count, where the final numbers are coming in. But it could impact the budget significantly if the numbers don't hold to what we put in the budget. So just putting that out there as this is an area we really have to watch.
And just to provide some scale, it's roughly $8,000 per kid. So if it's 100 kids fewer than what we thought, we actually thought maybe we had a conservative estimate, but we're just operating in an era where there is no benchmarks to measure from right now. Everything's new every day. Even the headlines that the ladies who came to speak tonight could be shifting open enrollment to e-achieve as we sit here.
Right.
So, and is that shift in our kids going there, or is it kids coming from other districts to go there? We're in conversations with a few area school districts about maybe them accessing e-achieve to be their virtual format. Those conversations kind of, died off a little bit, but maybe they're coming back and might be stronger than before. So, but it's $8,000 a kid, give or take.
It's up, it's close to 9,000. It
9,000?
might be over 9,000 this year. The numbers were just released. And it's over 12,000 for special education students, but we pretty much max our special education students and have a waiting list, so I don't expect that that's going to decrease very much because I think there's enough students waiting to come in on the special education program. So it's 9,000.
So we could be to 1 million fast. So just something that we're watching very closely. Not much we can do about it. It's parents and families making decisions. But certainly we're on top of it and we'll respond accordingly. We've already issued contracts to teaching staff, though, so the ability to right size might become more difficult. So,
Are we still advertising for eAchieve right now?
yeah, and they're actually doing another push in the month of August. I can't remember the details of that off the top of my head, but
We just paid $14,000 for postage last week on a mailing that they're sending out. So it's a pretty substantial mailing that's going out. I don't know who the target audience is, but I know we've got to check for that to get that out fast.
They're doing TV too, because I just saw one.
yeah, I think there was a TV push as
on
well.
TV. Yep, and I've had quite a few people ask me about e-achieve. So I think we'll be good. It all depends what the area districts, a lot of them do.
Yeah,
That's the wild card. What happens with virtual education in other districts? So, because not a lot of districts have
There's a lot of moving
the
parts.
the e-achieve
Variety.
variety that we have. So, that's the
I don't mean to be doom and gloom, but I just wanted to, it's
Yeah,
important.
no, I know.
It's important to point that out because it could be, depending which
Yeah,
way it
right.
goes, it could
Yeah.
be a very big topic
Could
of
be,
conversation
for
in
sure.
October.
No,
So-
definitely.
I thought, one of my first reactions when Sherry shared these numbers with me, well, people are waiting to make a decision. Well, then I thought, well, why wouldn't you have applied early and hedged your bet?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So that kind of blew that theory out of the water pretty quick. So, but
Yeah, it
this is a
changes so
major
quick.
shift. I can't believe that there's not going to be some significant correction there, but I also don't know. no way of knowing.
Right.
Looked on Friday, and I think there were a few more alternative apps in already, but maybe 20 more. So,
And again, apps don't mean kid. That's an app.
right.
So parents can
Right.
opt out too
Yeah.
and never show up to eAchieve.
Yeah,
So
those parents.
it's not
can be
it's
hedging
not
their
a
bets.
binding contract by any stretch.
Right. And it's just the only number we have to really compare from year to year on a
Right.
basis to look at the trend at least.
Yeah.
And did more kids apply last year that didn't need to reapply this
Right.
year? And we've already captured those
Yeah.
kids. So
Right.
it's all be interesting to see.
Yeah, definitely.
Hey, equalized property valuation, I did talk about that already, that we've budgeted for a 2% increase. Not sure how the housing market's going to fall into that, if that's really going to inflate that this year. I don't know how quick they are to respond to the housing market trends as far as doing the property valuations. But we will know that by the time the final budget's due. Our levy, we're looking at 8.02 versus 8.03 last year. And we probably should have targeted 8.03. I wasn't looking at the rounding difference from one year to the next, but state equalization aid, we've talked about a decrease of 1.21% with the July 1st estimate. As Darren mentioned, our expenses were different. I plugged in all of our numbers as they were pre-audit, and it looked like potentially maybe another $300,000 might be coming because of where we were at with our expenditures. State per pupil aid, holding flat at $742,000 per pupil. There was the per pupil increase to the revenue limit was held. There was none this year. It was held flat. Employee compensation, that's just more of our note that the board approves that, and that was already approved this year and included in the budget as far as employee increases. Wisconsin retirement system, I believe it's holding at 6.75, but they don't have it posted on their website yet, but I was sure. Did you see something, Darren, at all?
I
on
thought
that?
it was holding too.
Yeah.
And they run on a calendar year, not
Correct.
a fiscal year, so.
Right, we usually have half of one year rate and half of another year rate, but I'm sure I saw something come through that said it was holding, but it's not updated on their website yet, but it's at 6.75%, so that's what's been budgeted. General fund balance. Our unaudited ending for this fiscal year is $391,416, which is 33% of our expenses of the prior year. The general rule is that we should be 15 to 25% of our expenses of the prior year. Now, some of that we're going to talk about a little later in the wrap-up, but a lot of that is the excess of claims, the money that we had this year. And we'll be looking at another meeting to move that into the claims reserve. It'll still keep our fund balance, the number the same, but it'll hold more of that money into our claiming. But we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But it is a number that's getting higher, and I know it's a number that people look at, so.
One thing with that range, and it's an acceptable range, I think it's even on DPI's website, but I don't think they factor in being self-funded for health insurance in that number, and that's a significant, and Sherry will cover that later on, but I don't know if that range is apples to apples to what we're doing here, but.
What I'm going to do next month with our budget report, I'm going to come back with the breakdown of what consists of this 33%. How much of it is for claims, how much of it is just reserved for general, how much is for common school fund carryover. There's lots of different things that make up this fund balance, and so I'll come up with the percentages to show. I just wanted to get a little closer to our audit, which is next week, before sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, just off the top of my head, between what we hope to reserve in health insurance and what we've already reserved for OPEB, I want to say that's like $13 million of this total. So, but we'll do a more detailed report next month.
Okay, district debt, Fund 38 was paid in full, as we discussed. Fund 39 referendum debt has a balance of $38,100,050 and is scheduled to be paid in full by 2029, but that doesn't include defeasance, but I think if you look at that number and consider it was $60 million, that's pretty significant to have been able to pay off that much debt already. The personal property aid we've already talked about. That'll be most likely holding firm. So then the important thing here is looking at the next page is the preliminary budget. This is the budget adoption format. And what this budget does is for Fund 10, it includes our interfund transfer to Fund 27 of $20,153,648, and that's to cover any special education costs that are not covered by grants and aid. It also includes carryover estimated to be $780,338 and a one-time textbook expenditure of $739,000 for a total of $1.5 million. And that would be scheduled to come out of that fund balance. So a little bit of the excess that we have in there, we've already looking to budget. We've budgeted a deficit to utilize some of that money. Our carryover is down from last year. Last year we had over $900,000 in carryover, so we've been working at trying to get that carryover number a little more in line and not have people holding so much money from year to year, but to utilize their budgets. And the textbooks, they just had a big cycle. I know Darren will be working with Cabinet on a plan moving forward, a textbook plan, so that we don't get a big hit like this in one particular year.
Yeah, the textbook's probably the most unique thing about this budget as we're presenting it tonight. It was part of our service reduction list, if you remember that back in March or April, that we would likely be making this recommendation to use fund balance to make these one-time. I mean, textbooks do get replaced eventually, but they're a long-term asset. So if you have any questions on that or want to discuss that, we can certainly try to answer your questions.
I was just wondering on the textbooks, 'cause I did notice that jumped out at me. Is that replacement of textbooks or is it new classes? Or, I mean, because I know that
I think it's cycling
I think it's
through
replacements.
because
It's replacements,
textbooks
okay.
change and curriculum changes, and so
Okay.
it's replacement of existing books.
Yeah, information updates, so you got to replace the books. It's not like a digital format, but, so it's primarily replacements and not new classes. Okay. Mr. Como.
I do like the budget adoption format. This is a really good summary of all the components, so I appreciate it. What I keep finding confusing, though, are ESSER funds. I mean, none of that's taken into consideration here, is it? Or if it is,
I have not budgeted for ESSER 2 or 3 yet in this budget because we're still working on what's the long-term plan for those. There's significant amount of money.
Right.
So, and we don't know. The other part of that is those grants can cross several years. So we don't know that we want them all in this year. We most likely would not want them all in this year. So while we're developing a plan and working on it, I pulled it out of the budget. There will be in the October budget an adjustment for that.
okay.
But if, like the people speaking today, if there's HVAC things we decide to do that aren't a part of the expenditures yet, then that's going to offset it. If there's things we think we want to use to help the budget, that will help offset expenditures. But ESSER 1 was
Okay.
spent, except for some of the private schools. We have just a little
Yeah, it
bit
was
of money in
spent last
private.
year.
But ESSER 1 is completely spent, so that does not play into this. But ESSER 2 and 3 are not put in the budget
Okay.
as of yet.
So would we then see in the budget adoption format a line item for ESSER or ESSER funds?
They would be rolled up into Fund 10 or operational. Yeah.
Okay. So that you pull that out then as a footnote.
What we could do is create a page. We have a page in the budget booklet that's referendum. Gave the history of the referendum. We have the revenue limit. We could create an ESSER page and just kind of walk through to provide
I think
more
that's a
detail.
great idea.
And I actually think under one of the ESSERs or maybe all of them, we have some reporting or
There are reporting requirements.
reporting requirements, but which would help address that. Yeah, it's certainly, our plan has been not to budget for them. One thing, we're still waiting on FEMA. I should say, we're maybe one of a very few districts in the state of Wisconsin that FEMA's even still talking to,
Right.
so there's hope.
We have heard back from FEMA in the past month that
Because we're the only ones
they're not
calling
going to
them?
look at everything that we asked for, but they had to bring it down to a list of things that they felt would be reasonable to pass, and nobody's gotten to that point yet, so.
We think we're doing better. Everyone else has gotten rejection.
Yeah, oh, they
letters,
have.
So, yes.
Right, it's flat, we're not
Or
getting it.
emails or whatever you get.
Okay.
So the planning here, or the thought processes, and it's tied into that long-range agenda item we have later on, is we have $370,000 of ESSER 2 or 3, and that was on that service reduction list that we've said, well, we're going to address it into this budget. But then the conversations I think we need to have about structural deficits and all those things that we've kind of knocked around, part of that is, what do we want to do with the ESSER funds? And I think it's better to have that as a separate conversation. Otherwise, it gets lost in a $200 million, or can get lost in a $200 million budget conversation. If I were to just bake something into Fund 10, so
I'm good with that.
it'll be
I agree with that, I should say. I just wanted to make sure that I was clear as to where they are in this presentation, and they aren't there for a reason. So I just wanted to make sure that they weren't buried somewhere and I just wasn't seeing it or understanding it or what have you.
And we
So-
didn't budget the revenue from a potential FEMA reimbursement, or I don't know or cost offset, or whatever you want to call it, or the unemployment that's still sitting out there, that we think we're eligible, the reimbursement for the unemployment from March of 20 to, I think, the end of 20, if I remember the range.
That might not hit our budget, though, so we might just have a windfall sometime next year on
It
that.
That's exactly what it would
Could
be.
be. Could
But
be.
they're saying it might not even, the last notification we got said, well, it might be coming later this year. It's coming, but they still don't know when.
Okay.
And so.
Fair enough.
We might not, I mean, I'm assuming we'll see it come in this budget, but until I get proof, I'm not putting it in the budget.
And again, I just want to make sure I wasn't missing something, or that, for some reason, those potential funds got pulled from us, so
No.
I'm glad that they haven't.
No, I
And
do
that
like
you guys
the-
are on top of that.
I do
so.
like the idea of adding an ESSER page to the budget booklet, because it's just as big as the referendum was, nearly, I mean, a third
Yes.
as big,
Right.
so.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, so I made a note, I will make sure to add that in. Special education, as always, has I missed, Fund 21 is our special projects. It seems rather large now because in order to comply with GASB 84, which was an accounting requirement, we had to look, and I know we've discussed it at prior meetings, that we had to look at our student activity accounts and determine, are they true student activity accounts? And the determination was made that they're not, and that they belonged in Fund 21 instead of Fund 60. So all of that money got transferred into Fund 21, and now we have a much larger balance, and all the activity through the year funnels through Fund 21. So that'll be a permanent situation where this is going to be a much higher balance than it's been in years past, and because that project has been completed for GASB 84. Special education budgeted to net out. That fund cannot have a beginning or negative or ending balance of any sort. Always has to start at zero and end at zero.
We'll always have that one right.
That's right.
I make that vow to It'll always be zero at
That's
the end of the
right.
year.
Fund 38, while we have no more debt, there's a little bit of money in there left in the account. I believe we'll be able to transfer that over to Fund 39 to pay debt off with, but I just need to double check with DPI and the requirements. That's mainly interest and things that were accrued over the years. Referendum debt, we have in there what our expenditures are currently and what we're looking at with the defeasance. Once we determine that, whole final would be looking at a board budget change to change the expenditure to match what the defeasance is if it's determined the defeasance should be paid out next year. That'll be a different conversation at another meeting. Fund 41 is our overall capital projects account that we levy for every year. Because of some of the ESSER money and other things, we were able to create a bit of a fund balance over the last couple of years. And we're looking at keeping that fund balance out there for future projects. Referendum, we're looking at spending down everything that's left over. There's right now $255 in there, as far as that's what's left to pay off any of the remaining projects that we have, the remaining bills for the projects that are currently wrapping up. Fund 46 is the capital expansion. That's the account that we set up about 5 years ago that you can't touch it until this year. We magically hit the date in May, so that money is there. We'd like to put another $250,000 into it this year to keep building that account for future capital projects. Fund 47 was the turf account. As you approved in the prior meeting, we were able to do a transfer from Fund 10 to bring that down to zero. This would be the last year that it'll show up on the report. Property sales funds, this is just money that's available from when we've made sales, property sales and things like that. We've got a balance right now of $2.2 million. This also encompasses the sinking fund for the pool. So there's a small amount that goes into there in revenue every year. That's what the revenue is showing here for $20,050. That's the revenue for the pool. And the expenditures are what the total of the sinking fund is. They may not use that whole thing, but we keep it in there as an expenditure to show that it's available to them to use. Food service, we just keep trying to spend that down, that balance down. We coming into this year with 1.7 million again. And we really should be at about $1,950,000 to $1 million because we're not supposed to be carrying over more than 3 months worth of expenditures for that account. So we have included in here, the budget is looking at using the National School Lunch Program and not the SSO. And then we've also added some equipment improvement expenditures in here to try to work on bringing that fund balance down. Scholarships are now at a zero because that also fell under the GASB 84. And in the ruling and using Fund 72 for scholarships, the way our scholarships are handled, it doesn't qualify. So that was pulled out and put in Fund 21 also. So now Fund 21 houses all of our scholarship money. And they all have separate account numbers, so we still can track and know exactly what's in Fund 21, what all that money is intended to be used for. And Fund 80, our community service, we're just, that's where we have half of our SROs go there, our library liaison account, half of our community liaison in the building, and then our string academy account. And so we just keep trying to keep the fund balance down on that one and keep the levy as low as possible to cover those expenditures. But overall, we have our fund balance going into the year is $65,672,791, with our receipts expected to be $202,039,171, and our expenditures to be $203,640,131, with an estimated ending fund balance of $71,831. Any questions on this? This would be the budget that we're looking to, the level of the budget that we're looking to get approval on. There's a lot of detail that goes behind this. There's a different version of the tax levy summary, but it's basically the same information that I shared to start this conversation. Then there's more detail for every single fund going out there. And if you want to look at the detail of where the expenses and revenues are going and coming from. And then we have our 25-year tax levy history. And then we have the 25-year mill rate history and the 25-year equalized valuation history. I think you can, on those 25-year documents, there's a 3-year average, a 5-year average, and then a 10-year average. So it's an interesting view at looking at what we've done over the past several years. Any questions on any of this? And there's also the revenue limit document for your reading pleasure. It's very colorful.
It's pretty. Any questions for Sherry? Mr. Como?
Question for you.
Oh. Okay.
Are we looking for separate motions between approving the budget and then another motion to approve the preliminary tax levy? Or are you looking to have that all done in one motion? I
Done in
thought
one motion, I think.
I think historically we've kind of done it a little of both ways.
Yeah, we have done it both ways.
Probably the cleaner way is to have two separate motions on it. Again, this is only the preliminary budget, so
Right.
I don't know if we're stuck to a certain path.
Right.
In October, we always come back with separate motions because
Yeah.
you are setting a specific levy at that time. So it's really whatever the comfort of the committee is. I don't think procedurally there's an issue either way.
We could do one motion and
break them up then?
break them up when it's go time.
Okay.
Sure. Anybody have a problem with that?
No.
So if there's no questions of Sherry, I'd be looking for a motion to approve the 2021-2022 preliminary budget and tax levy as presented. Preliminary.
So moved.
Montiel, is there a second? Mr. Dees seconds. Any further discussion? Questions, concerns? No? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None? 4-0. Thank you, Sherry. Very good report, as usual. And now we are on discussion information items. Monthly budget report.
So I don't know if you noticed how sparse my report was this month, but
July.
the first, exactly. It's our typical July report. I did include the actual report itself, but it's difficult to really look at that. The budget's all in Skyward, but it looks like we received no revenue in July, but that's because all of the revenues that we get in July have been booked as receivables into the prior school year. So when they come in, they go against our receivable account. They don't show up as revenue yet in this year. So we'll start seeing more revenue for this year in September. July and August, we don't see a lot of the revenue, the 21-22 revenue yet. And then from an expense perspective, at the end of the school year, when we have expenditures that we've made, but we haven't paid the bills yet, we have to book those back as payables. So we have to do a journal entry that takes and says, okay, well, we're expecting all these bills to come in, and so we get we have usually copies of what they're expected to be, but they're not ready to pull the trigger to make the payment. So we book them as payables, and then we reverse those payables come July 1st. And so the numbers look very skewed because the payables get reversed and it looks like we have a lot of negatives in expenditures. So there really isn't a lot to look at and discuss. It isn't a telling report at this point. We don't have a lot of expenditures yet in July either. So I can say we're in good shape so far.
We're under
So far
budget at this point.
Right. Way under budget right now.
Yeah, barely.
I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on it in particular, because some of the numbers do look really wacky, but those numbers are due to the payables, and the receivables don't really show up on there at all, but the payables do skew it. And so that what happens with the effect of that is when we pay those invoices, we actually pay them in 21-22, but because we've reversed the payables in 21-22, we have this negative pot sitting out there. And then when the bills come in, it's a wash. It washes it out for this year, so those expenditures don't show up as expenses in 21. They affect our cash in 21-22, but they don't impact our expenses. Does that make sense? Kind of? Sort
Kind of.
I can try and explain
The
it
auditor
better.
will be here in a few months to
Yeah, right.
answer any question. I mean, here to report
be
out.
here, yes.
To answer any questions you might have had on that.
It's an accrual process, right?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Because we need to pay for the things, we need to record the expenditures in the fiscal year that the work has been done or the merchandise has been received. And sometimes there's just timing issues on those
Your
invoices.
construction projects are always split half and half. And for example. I mean, other things too.
Right, we have to account for we have to get invoices from all of our construction vendors on how much work they've done to June 30th, but we don't want to pay them until the project's complete. So that part from June 30th, that's a lot of the big amounts of the payables. We know what the payable is, but we're not going to pay the actual bill until the work is done, probably in August.
Okay, so I do have one question, and I may be jumping ahead on this, but I'm looking at employee fringe benefits. I'm just wondering what the option plan is.
I believe those are administrator benefits, but I would have to double.
403B contributions.
That 403B
People who have it in
contribution?
their contracts, yes.
My knowledge, it says health insurance 13,606,000. Is that what we're planning on spending?
That's what actuarially, we come up with a number and we
Okay.
hire someone to do this
Yes.
of what we think we're going to spend.
Gotcha.
And then they come up with what people would equate to being a premium like you'd get from an insurance company, but
Right.
we actually get a funding rate.
Okay,
And then we use that to pull money out of, because employees pay 12%
Yep.
and figure out everyone's share.
Okay.
And that's what we think to garner from that funding rate is 13.6. Again, we think there's pent up health claims, and actually health claims started to tick up a little bit. And if we go over this number, that's when you get into your reserves and
Okay.
reducing the fund balance that we're sitting on.
yeah, they just reported that on the news, the uptick in doctor visits. Mr. Como?
You had mentioned that employees pay 12%. Do some pay 17% because they don't participate in their wellness program?
Oh yeah, there's the staggered if you don't do the wellness. Now this past year we didn't do the wellness because of COVID and everything. We didn't want to bring everyone into our buildings and wait in line.
That makes sense.
But we'll be returning
back
to
to that.
that. Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
Yep.
fair enough.
And that's a pretty small percentage of people that don't do the
Just checking.
the wellness. Yep.
And
Fair question.
the income protection insurance, what is that?
Disability. It's the
Oh, that's
long-term
disability,
disability.
gotcha, okay, alrighty. Alrighty, is there any other questions? I just like to see odd things.
No, it's good.
Includes my report.
Awesome, excellent, great, another great report. Next up for discussion information items is the 2020-2021 fiscal year end update.
Hey,
Take it away.
guess I'm on again.
It's the Sherry Show.
Yeah, it is.
That's right.
Right, it is. Good show.
Jim and Jess and I should be at home right now.
You guys could go virtual.
Yeah, we could watch.
We wanted to just give a preliminary wrap-up, preliminary view of where we're at for year-end. Our audit is next week, so hopefully this will hold true to be our final wrap-up, but auditors like to find things and tweak things, so there may be some small changes, but we certainly don't anticipate anything big happening once the audit is complete. So I kind of pulled out some of the key components of things to talk about. And we've hit on some of them already, but with Fund 10, we went into it with a lot of unknowns because of the pandemic. And we budgeted for a deficit of $1.9 million in Fund 10. And we ended with a surplus of $3.8 million in Fund 10. So if you look at the net consideration of it, that's actually 5.7 more to fund balance than we had expected. Some of that was less expenditures than we thought we'd have on some of the mitigation type things. Some of it was, ESSER covering a lot of it. There was just, I highlighted some of the reasons for the surplus. Probably one of the biggest ones is the open enrollment receipts. We ended up with a substantially larger number than we had originally budgeted for. We did change that in our budget amendment, but in comparing this to where we expected to end the year, that contributed to it. We had a higher than normal Medicaid reimbursement. Don't expect that next year because with students virtual, we don't get to claim any virtual work that the people are doing with Medicaid. It has to be an in-person type thing. So we expect next year that'll fall back to more normal or even possibly a little bit lower. And it's some of those reimbursements are real time from our current year, and then there's the annual reconciliation where we get a large chunk of money every year. Health claims remained at a low level, even though we anticipated that as the pandemic got better, people would start going back and seeing doctors, and that's just starting to happen now. We had a large E-rate reimbursement, which is a technology-related reimbursement. We never really know, Steve files for those, but we never really know when we're going to get them. So they come in when they want to come in, and we had a rather large one this year. And then we had higher special education categorical aid than was budgeted, and that reduced the transfer in Fund 10 to 27. So those are some of the reasons why we had that larger surplus. Now, again, as we've talked, some of that we need to do something with from a claims perspective, because we can't carry over, we're only supposed to carry over in our liability account what our IBNR is. And we had our HNI do our IBNR calculation. They do it for us every year, and it's still low. It's usually 1.8 million, but IBNR captures the claims that have happened, like in June, and that just haven't been billed yet. And their IBNR came in at $1 million. We're usually looking at 1.8 million, in that range, anywhere from 1.5 to 1.8. So the IBNR is still relatively low, but we have a larger claim surplus, so that's why we're looking to get that moved into our reserves for claims, because otherwise our options are a little limited in what we can do with that money. So, and we've had that conversation as the year progressed. Fund 21, we already discussed that. With the GASB changes for funds, the activity accounts and scholarships, this one has ballooned into a much bigger account than it has been in the past.
Bless you.
I hate to sneeze or cough in a room anymore, because you worry.
We're still
You're more
human.
worried about Jim than me, apparently.
I tried to go back. Okay, Fund 27, as I talked about in Fund 10, it's the flip side. The categorical aid came in higher, and so it would allowed us to have less transfer to from 10. Fund 50, we budgeted a deficit of $1.3 million in Fund 50, but ended up with another surplus into that account, and that was added on to the $1.7 million surplus we already had. So the deficit was for the kitchen renovation projects, which did take place, but we're working on the timing of the invoicing, but we tried to book everything back to a payable that we could there. But really, that summer food service program, our reimbursement rate was significantly higher. So, and because we only were able to pay Aramark a higher rate for April, May, and June, were the only 3 months that we were able, per DPI, to pay them the higher amount. So it really kept our surplus up. We'll be looking to spend that down next year. Again, Fund 72 we've already talked about. Let's see. And then Fund 80 I talked about on the budget report, but we had a lower participation in the Waukesha String Academy, and just created a very small surplus in that fund, and we're using that to help offset the levy to keep that down. Any other highlights you can think of that we?
I guess the only thing I'd want to follow up on is, I know it was kind of a strange year again, but the health insurance, I know our fund balance number seems high, but, claims have been incredibly low, but it wasn't that many years ago we pulled $1 million out of reserves to cover claims in a year that was running really well, and then it wasn't. And so by adding this $4 million into claims reserves will bring us up to about 5 months of expenditures. Just to give you an idea, we spend $21 or $22 million a year on health insurance each year. So it is a lot of money. It is. But those reserves, if you're going to be self-funded, are are very, very important. So I just want people lock on to $4 million and not know the scale and the risk and exposure we have. So.
Yeah. Mr. Como.
I do agree with building up those reserve funds for our healthcare claims. But I have a technical question. If we do move monies into that particular fund, are we able to move monies out of that fund if let's say we just have another fantastic year next year and we say we have another $5 million left over? And let's say that just keeps going on year after year after year, and we keep piling up and it gets up to whatever, 20 million, let's say. Mm-hmm. Are we able to reverse that? Or once they're in the reserve, it has to stay in the reserve?
It's just a designation of fund balance. It's not like the old OPEB investment thing where it went into a trust. This is a designation of fund balance. So the board has the authority.
Well, but the
Is the
tricky
same
part
true
there
for the
is
cap
that
for Fund 46? I thought once we move it into Fund 46, there's laws that say, don't we have to use that? Fund 46 is for capital.
Correct. And that was part of the resolution that you approved when you
So
created.
that one we can't reverse, right? So there are times
The
when
thing
we
to
can't.
keep in mind with the health insurance, though, is first of all, we're not the only ones putting money into it. The employees are putting in 12%. But there's ways, like one of the things we're doing to lower that, which let's say we want to provide some budget relief, and we want to use health insurance.
Yep.
Heading into, well, I guess now it's this fiscal year, we froze health or funding rates or premiums, however you want to look at it. So we're sharing some of these reserves if we do have a bad year, because our consultants would have said, you should probably raise them by 5%. And we said, well, no, our reserves are getting high enough that we do want to disperse it back to the participants in the plan.
And that's why I'm asking is because I do think that it's good that we're able to keep the premiums level for our employees this year. I think that's good. So that's why I was asking the question is if once we move it into the reserves for the healthcare claims, if we can move it back out. And you said yes, basically. We have the ability to move monies around. And I want to understand that. I want to understand that because I think, this board needs to decide every year, and you guys make recommendations, how much are premiums going up.
Right.
This is the first time we've ever been able to say zero since I've been on the board for 19 years. Okay.
I think we can do it. Now, there's two ways in my mind of doing it. One, there's another board action. Now, that one, I think there's some issues with the employees being part of it, but there's other things we can do. Let's say the reserves were $1 million more than what we're even talking about. I could have budgeted next year for health premiums to go up or down 5% and disperse those. So in my mind, there's a board action path to doing these things, and there's a budgetary accounting path to doing these things. Just like Fund 46, if let's say you said, all right, Darren, we have too much money there, we need some budget relief. I would budget projects to be expensed that normally would have been budgeted in our operational budget. Mm-hmm. I would just code those to Fund 46. Accounting-wise, we accomplish what you want to do without the board having to take some formal action or besides the approval of a budget. But that's my thoughts on it.
And I would just add that if we do have another year where the amount is substantial, we may get pushback from DPI that it needs to be returned to the employees. Because what DPI is trying to safeguard is schools not overcharging their employees.
Making a profit
health
on the
insurance, make a
insurance,
profit on it to
Yeah.
offset their budget.
For sure.
That isn't what they want. So that would be another conversation next year if we got into that position on how do we do that? Is it another case where we either lower premiums, keep them the same again, and we can show that we're ticking down that balance by having higher claims than we are bringing in the money? But I do think each one is a unique conversation.
Yeah, Mr. Como.
And that's why I'm asking the questions, because I think we need to have a better understanding at the board level what our options are. I mean,
can come back with
if there are multiple options, I'd like to see multiple options, not just one of the options.
And I do think we're getting to the point where reserves, I have 6 months as kind of the top of, like fund balance had that 15 to 25%. And we'll double check with HNI, but I thought once you got up to about 6 months of anticipated expenditures, you'd have a plan.
Sure.
Which
And
is fair.
is that driven by state statutes? Is that driven by federal statutes? What is that driven by? So just having some understanding of what those parameters are and what the choices that we potentially can make. And you know,
believe there's state
fortunately, we're in a position where we can talk about this. We've been in the other position for many years where we've never had to talk about these things before.
When we
so
took
that's
that $1
good.
million out of reserves, was it 4 years ago now? I want to say at the time that was like 25% of our reserves,
Right.
Yeah,
maybe even a little higher than that.
it was.
But it's good, and I think that fund balance report will provide us that opportunity to go through the pieces and kind of review, what's been done by board action and what's been done by other events that may have occurred, the sale of a property or whatever. But I do think we're in a good position where we can start talking about, having flat health insurance premiums. I would caution you, though, for those of you who've been around, Economwalk was self-funded at one time.
They were self-funded.
And
at
they
one
used
time.
to not follow their consultant's lead on where funding rates should be. And eventually it drove their self-funded health insurance program right into the ground.
Sure.
So it has to be a well laid out, thought out plan. And it can't be the simple answer at the budget table. Let's just do this because it'll buy us a year and health insurance got to come around, right? And then it didn't. So
Well, yeah, all it takes is a
it's
transplant.
a slippery slope.
A transplant or two, and all of a sudden you're burning
Oh,
up
yeah.
a couple million
Burning
dollars.
through significant dollars.
Yes, for sure. And God, that doesn't happen to anybody, but it does happen.
But we're in a good place to have a lot of good conversations.
Yep.
Yeah, this
Whether it's
is-
ESSER or health insurance and all these other things. So
I prefer this side of the ledger.
yeah.
Your conversations.
Alrighty, any other
Questions?
questions? Next up under discussion information items is long-range planning.
Yeah, we've had several conversations and this slide deck's also in docs if you want to look at. And this is only 4 slides, but about our structural deficit and ESSER and all these funds that, what's our strategy? And I've gotten a lot of questions. So I just came up with a very short slide deck. I have in board docs just some baseline information about our most recent enrollment study. There was a statewide enrollment study done by the same firm that they gave me for nothing, but it just shows that there's just fewer and fewer kids. Birth rate continues to be low compared to historical averages, yada, yada, yada. And so that information is out there because resident enrollment will be a big part of any long-range budget planning process we go. And maybe it's just a kind of a lengthier conversation and recapping what's going on, so the board just has a better general feel of how this all works. It's really your call on that. So here are the topics that I see us talking about. As I mentioned, resident enrollment. I can promise you I will probably say that 1,000 times during this process because it's just that important. We'll discuss the per pupil revenue sources that are out there, revenue limit, but also for every student we also lose some per pupil categorical aid on top of that. We have a state budget, and we can talk about what that state budget did or didn't do for us. The cost drivers, and I think you probably know the biggest one is employee compensation and benefits. Not only the inflationary factor on health insurance that we've been battling for a couple decades now, but the harder it is to find employees and the natural inflation of finding good employees to come work for you. And that might go away someday. It might not. I don't know the answer to that or when it'll happen. But then I think all of that molds into what do we do with the ESSER dollars? What the strict financial person in me would say it only should be spent on one-time expenditures because it's one-time money. I also know we have a structural deficit that we address every year, and Dr. Siebert doesn't want every program standing in his office trying to save itself from a list that might be built. And in the end, I think it's going to be some sort of blend, would be my guess. We'll talk about that. What's that look like in year 3 or 4 when those dollars run out and those expenditures are still with us in the form of staff and or materials or equipment. One thing I would shy away from in this conversation is discussing level of taxation, and I know that might sound funny, but to me, this conversation is really about all of our revenue and all of our expenditures, no matter what the source. So I think you begin this conversation of we're going to use our full revenue authority and just get the concepts down and then start digging into what's an acceptable tax rate. But the tax rate swings so much with every 2-year state biennial budget or debt. And I just don't want us to get bogged down on that loan topic. And again, I don't want to make that sound like that's not a very important topic because we all get a property tax bill. You know, we're all in that. But those are the major topic areas that I would foresee. And I'll hit on it just because it's that important. Here's our revenue limit count, resident enrollment. This is summer school and the third Friday count. And you can see where we were in 2013. We had 13,071 students. COVID, artificially low, I would argue, for what we had projected. But we were down 1,500 kids, times 10,000 and some dollars per kid, plus whatever the per pupil aid is, $700 or whatever. You're talking almost $11,000 per student. Now, we would also have more staff if we had all those. It's not clean money.
Right.
Now, we are projecting that we come back a little bit because COVID is artificially low, but that trend is still there. And the projections, and that's why I included the enrollment projections in board docs, is just so you can see, and they use different methodologies, but the trend tends to be the same. So, again, a topic we'll touch on many times. Now, resident kids aren't the only kids we serve. We don't have 11,651 kids in our classrooms because you have open enrollment coming and going. And then you have E&Chieve, who kids who aren't even in our facilities, but we're in charge of their education. So this is strictly a funding count of students. So I'm throwing this out here just as kind of again, a framework for a discussion. I think the workshops work well for larger topics like this. I think the conversation's more casual. We would also have all of our board members here instead of just the 5 of us or 5 of you here. So I would picture kind of a September meeting, just kind of a educational meeting of what are the major players, resident enrollment, revenue limit, those types of things. Identify the most common question I've gotten lately is what's causing the structural deficit? And we can discuss that. People could go away from that meeting and think about what they heard and maybe generate some questions after they have sat through the meeting. And then come back in October and start talking about solutions, how to use ESSER. Maybe it's meetings beyond this. Maybe it's meetings more frequent than one time a month because you might forget a lot, especially in a topic like school finance that you're not working with as part of your day job. But again, just framework to really see where you want this to go. I do think that in terms of cost-saving measures, that there's some big topics out there that we need to take a look at, whether it's physical, how many square feet of space do we need for fewer and fewer kids? What happens if enrollment bounces back? You don't want to go too far. So it's more art than science probably on a topic like that, but just those types of conversations. So that's all I had. Provide me any guidance you want. I think we're willing to do any format that you're comfortable with, whether it's running it through FNF, and willing to tackle any topics that you think need to be discussed. I will tell you, for anything for 20, it seems weird to say this, 22, 23, any major things, there's some timelines we need to hit. We issue contracts next May. If you get into something involving a school site or something, you really make that decision in February-ish. So that calendar all of a sudden shrink up on you really quick. Or major health, things that we'd have to take time and study, and it's beyond just plant facility topics. But so that's what my lengthy presentation has.
Workshop, I like those. I think they're great. Can you get us anything that you have available prior to the workshop so we can, do a little reading ahead of time? Or
Yeah, I've actually later on in the slide deck, I've talked about doing 3, and I would do screenshot videos of me doing voiceover.
Okay.
The first one would be revenue, so I'd cover revenue limit and per pupil aid, and then send that out to the board beforehand, so you don't have to sit through a lecture on,
Right.
and then do a very abbreviated presentation on those topics. And then I'd do an expense one, and then the third one, I don't know what that one, what's our budget look like? Maybe talk a little bit on ESSER, and what we can and can't do, but get those out there so you can study them and generate questions from
Yeah,
them.
that'd be great. Thank you.
Mr. Como?
Yeah, our structural deficit we've had for a while, and every year, our administration tries to balance out a number of factors to be able to balance our budget. And hats off to Jim and your team on that, and prior to you, Jim, to Todd and the team. There's a lot to consider when you're trying to figure out what programs exist, which ones don't, what are they staffed at, what levels are they staffed at, and there's some really big topics that this board can discuss and potentially take action on to help with that balancing of the budget each year. And that's really what we're beginning to look at here. Those bigger topics that have high impact on the district. And we're just at a time where I think we need to be looking at those things. So I appreciate your question, Mr. Montillo. There's some complexities to this topic. There's many facets to the topic. So anything that we can do to enhance the productivity and or the efficiency during the workshops would be much, much appreciated. And I think the timeline of September, starting in September, is fine. And probably at least 2. We'll be able to figure out as a team, as a group, if 2 is enough, if we need to dive deep into a few other things. Do we need to break things off into committees after a couple workshops? That'll become a little bit more clear as we kind of go through it. But I think this is a good suggestion.
Yep, so I guess that's the consensus.
All right, well,
Like it.
we'll get some dates on the
Yep,
books, and then we'll go from there.
fantastic. Thank you very much, Darren. All right, that brings to a close our discussion information items. Next up is other business. Does anybody have any recommendation for future committee hearings? I guess we're going to have the discussion about air quality.
Yeah, the HVAC report will be in September.
Yep. Awesome. And the structural deficit was the other one that I had in mind, but that's taken care of. So is there anything else that anybody wants to see potentially on the next? If anything comes to mind, email Darren and I, and we will make it happen. All righty. And we do need an executive session? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'd be looking for a motion, which I can make. Or you want to make it?
Oh,
You want to make it?
You're, sure.
Okay, excellent.
I'll move
Just
to
wanna-
adjourn to executive session pursuant to WISSTAT Section 19.85, Sub 1, Sub E, for deliberating or negotiating the purchasing of public properties, investing of public funds, or conducting other specified public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require a closed session.
Second for Mr. Dietz. That'll be a roll call vote.
Mr. Montiel?
Aye.
Mr. Como?
Aye.
Mr. Dietz? Aye. Mr. McCaffrey?
Aye.
Mr. Chair, I need to be